There are stories that begin like whispers, small fragments of truth carried by time, scattered among the waves, lost in the silence of the sea. Stories that resurface decades later, no longer as simple events, but as legends, powerful enough to captivate entire generations. The story of the SS Cotopaxi is one of them. Before it became a symbol of mystery, before it was dragged into the mythos of the Bermuda Triangle, before it was transformed into a ghost ship by books, films, and sensational headlines, the Cotopaxi was something far more ordinary and far more human. It was a ship, a hard-working, steel-hulled cargo vessel built in an era when the world was rebuilding itself after one of the darkest conflicts in history. Our journey begins in 1918, at the height of industrial expansion following World War I, in the shipyards of Great Lakes Engineering Works. In Icorse, Michigan, men worked day and night in a rhythm that matched the urgency of the times. Sparks flashed from welding torches, rivets clanged like heavy metallic raindrops, giant steel plates rose slowly into place, piece by piece, forming the skeleton of what would soon become one of hundreds of American merchant ships designed to supply a world in recovery. Amid the smell of oil, the roar of machinery, and the raw energy of reconstruction, hull number 1060 began to take shape. It was not born extraordinary. It did not stand out among the dozens of ships built beside it. But destiny tends to choose its own protagonists. The ship was christened SS Cotopaxi, named after a volcano in Ecuador, a towering peak known for its dormant menace and unpredictable fury. An odd choice, perhaps a poetic one, certainly. But no one at the time imagined how strangely fitting that name would become in the decades to follow. The Cotopaxi was designed with a straightforward purpose: to haul heavy cargo across long distances, through heat, storms, darkness, and uncertainty. At 78 meters long, powered by 2 large coal-fired boilers and a triple expansion steam engine, it was the embodiment of early 20th century maritime engineering, functional, sturdy, and built for endurance. On November 16, 1918, just days after the armistice that ended the Great War, the Cotopaxi was officially delivered to the United States Shipping Board. It was launched into a world that was exhausted, hopeful, and hungry for reconstruction. Nations needed fuel, supplies, and raw materials. Trade routes reopened like veins, bringing life back to an injured body. And for a brief moment, the world felt new again. The Cotopaxi's early missions were not glamorous. They rarely are. Merchant ships don't carry glory. They carry necessity. Coal, lumber, machinery, grain, and steel. The lifeblood of cities and industries. The ships made in voyages carried it up and down the American coast, stopping in ports like Boston, Jacksonville, Charleston, and Havana. Crews rotated in and out, learning the vessel's temperament, its groans, its vibrations, the way it responded to waves, the way its bulk shifted under heavy load. Sailors often say that a ship is like a living organism. It breathes, it listens, it remembers, and the Cotopaxi remembered everything. It remembered the storms it endured. It remembered the long hours in rough seas. It remembered the hands that tended its boilers and kept its engine alive. It remembered the men who walked its decks, telling stories to pass the time, dreaming of home. For years, the Cotopaxi labored as a reliable workhorse of the merchant fleet. But beneath this routine, small warning signs began to appear. Nothing dramatic, just the natural wear of time and neglect. The vessel had been constructed quickly, like many ships of its era, and like any steel structure exposed to salt, heat, and constant strain. It aged, a dent here, a weakened plate there, rivets loosening slightly under vibration, minor leaks that crews patched up without giving much thought. No one knew, no one could know that these small weaknesses would one day play a crucial role in its destiny. But long before danger approached, the Cotopaxi lived an ordinary sailor's life. In the ports where it docked, coal dust clung to its hull like black snow. Steam hissed from valves as workers loaded and unloaded cargo. The sound of boots on steel echoed every morning as men prepared for another day at sea. The ocean was both their workplace and their world, and the Cotopaxi was their home. Some sailors saw it as a reliable companion. Others called it stubborn, especially in rough waters, but all of them respected it. Respect is essential when your life depends on what floats beneath your feet. And so, the Cotopaxi carried on voyage after voyage, year after year, unaware that history had already chosen it. Unaware that one day, its name would be spoken not as a simple cargo vessel, but as the centerpiece of a global mystery. For now, it was only a ship. But the ocean, as always, was watching. And in its vast, unforgiving silence, the sea was preparing the path that would transform an ordinary freighter into one of the most talked-about ghost ships of all time. But that transformation, the turning point of an unremarkable vessel into a legend whispered for generations, would begin soon, with a voyage that was supposed to be routine, a destination that was supposed to be safe, and a storm that was supposed to be just another test. The day that would change everything was approaching, and the Cotopaxi had no idea. The Cotopaxi's early years at sea were defined by routine, the kind of routine that shapes every working vessel. Storms came and went, cargo was loaded, transported and unloaded, new crew members boarded, others said their goodbyes. The seasons changed. But the ship sailed on. Yet routine at sea has a way of hiding danger in plain sight. Crew members get used to small problems. They learn to live with rattling pipes, stubborn valves, and metallic groans. A loose rivet here, a worn hinge there, nothing that stops a voyage, nothing that feels urgent. But the ocean remembers every weakness, and sometimes it demands payment. The Cotopaxi experienced its first serious warning sign in June of 1919. It was on a voyage to Brazil, navigating through the shallow waters near the coast of Para, a region notorious for shifting sandbanks and deceptive currents. Without warning, the Cotopaxi ran aground. The impact jolted the entire ship, a violent tremor that reverberated through the steel hull. Men stumbled. Equipment clattered across the floor. Dust and coal shook loose from the ceiling of the cargo hold. When the crew rushed to assess the damage, they realized the ship was stuck deeply embedded in the muddy seabed. For hours they tried everything to free her. Engines roared, commands echoed across the deck. But the Cotopaxi refused to budge. The only way out was to lighten the load. Crew members were forced to unload part of the cargo, nearly 400 tons of coal, by hand, under the scorching tropical heat. Men worked until their hands bled. Some nearly collapsed from exhaustion. It was brutal, but it worked. Eventually, the Cotopaxi broke free. She continued to Salvador, damaged but afloat. It was a relief, but not a victory. The hull had suffered, the machinery had strained, and the event left a scar, both physical and symbolic, on the ship's history. Ships, like people, do not emerge from such ordeals unchanged. Over the next years, the Cotopaxi continued to operate, but the incident in Brazil was a reminder that the vessel was not invincible. In 1920, another event reinforced that lesson. As the Cotopaxi approached Havana, it collided with a tugboat named Septuno. The smaller vessel sank. The Cotopaxi sustained only minor damage, but the accident once again hinted at a pattern. A ship built quickly, used heavily, and beginning to show its age. By 1925, the Cotopaxi had new owners, the Clinchfield Navigation Company, and a new primary job, transporting coal from the United States to ports in the Caribbean. Coal, a cargo as common as it was dangerous. Coal dust seeped into machinery. It corroded metal. It wore down equipment. And above all, when soaked with seawater, it shifted violently, a hazard that would one day seal the ship's fate. Throughout the fall of 1925, the Cotopaxi made several routine trips between Charleston and Havana. Crews changed. Reports were filed. Repairs were made, but never deeply enough. The ship worked. The ship endured. The ship continued forward. But by late November, the atmosphere within the maritime world was anything but calm. Storms were brewing along the southeastern coast of the United States, powerful systems that had already caused damage across the region. Still, on November 29, 1925, the Cotopaxi departed Charleston with 32 men on board, a full cargo of coal, and a destination that should have been simple: Havana, Cuba. It was supposed to be just another voyage, another routine run, another week at sea. But something felt different for many of the men as they prepared to depart. Some crew members reportedly expressed concerns about the condition of the cargo hatches. Others noted that the weather was not favorable, and the sea itself seemed restless, swollen by winds sweeping up the Atlantic. Yet ships of that era were built on schedules, and schedules were merciless. The Cotopaxi left port. The steam billowed from its funnels. The city faded behind it. The horizon opened ahead. For a time, everything appeared normal. But as the ship moved deeper into the open ocean, the clouds thickened. Winds rose. Waves grew more aggressive, slamming into the bow with increasing force. Inside the engine room, temperatures soared as coal shoveled into the boilers glowed bright orange. In the cargo hold, thousands of tons of coal shifted with each roll of the ship, and on deck, officers scanned the sky, reading signs the way seamen have read them for centuries. The Cotopaxi pressed on, unaware that the converging elements around it were forming more than just bad weather. They were forming catastrophe. Days later, somewhere between Charleston and Havana, the ocean began to reveal its true temperament. Winds screamed across the deck. Waves rose like jagged mountains. The Cotopaxi struggled against forces greater than any ship of its size could endure. Below deck, unseen by the world, one of the ship's greatest vulnerabilities was beginning to fail: the hatches covering the cargo hold. Under normal conditions, they were meant to keep the coal dry. But in storms, they were the final barrier between stability and disaster. As the weather worsened, as water crashed repeatedly onto the deck, droplets began to seep through the cracks, small at first, then larger. The Cotopaxi continued to fight. The crew continued to work, but the ocean does not tire. And the Cotopaxi, for the first time in its short life, was beginning to break. What happened next would lead to one of the most enduring maritime mysteries of the 20th century, a disappearance that would echo for decades, distorted by myth, amplified by fiction, and misunderstood by millions. But in that moment, on the deck of the Cotopaxi, none of that mattered. There were no legends yet, no rumors, no supernatural explanations. There was only a ship, a crew, a storm, and the beginning of the tragic final chapter that would change their lives forever. The storm that had been forming along the southeastern coast of the United States was no longer a distant threat. By the time the Cotopaxi pushed deeper into open waters, the weather had turned from troublesome to truly dangerous. The crew felt it before the instruments did. Sailors always do. The wind had a different kind of voice, a violent, uneven howl that signaled a storm gaining momentum. The ship's steel frame shuddered under pressure. Waves crashed with a weight that rattled the bolts in the hull. Inside the wheelhouse, Captain William J. Meyer studied the horizon with a stern, practiced gaze. He had crossed those waters many times before, faced storms far worse than this. But experience teaches something that no map or radio ever could. The ocean has moods, and this one was turning hostile. As the storm closed in, the Cotopaxi continued pushing south toward Cuba. The deck pitched sharply as the vessel plowed through the churning sea. Spray drenched the sailors working above, and each wave struck with a force that made the entire ship groan like a wounded animal. Below deck, the situation began to worsen. In the cargo hold, the coal, thousands of tons of it, began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a quiet slide, a thud, a slight change in balance. But with every roll of the ship, the movement grew more violent. Coal is a living cargo. It moves, it breathes, and when wet, it becomes unstable, almost fluid in the way it flows from side to side. For a vessel already fighting through a storm, this was a fatal combination. The men working near the hold noticed something terrifying. Water was seeping in. What began as small drips through the old hatch seams had turned into thin streams, running down into the coal like veins of dark liquid. They shouted for help. Officers rushed down with lanterns. Every face in the dim glow understood the gravity of what they were seeing. The hatches were failing, and if water continued to enter the hold, the Cotopaxi would lose all stability. Captain Meyer was informed immediately. The decision he faced was one every seaman dreads: push forward and hope the storm breaks, or turn back and battle the same waters that now blocked the path home. He chose to push forward. It wasn't recklessness, it wasn't stubbornness, it was logic. Harsh, unforgiving logic. Turning back in that weather might destroy the ship just as surely, but forward still held the chance of escape. By the second day at sea, the Cotopaxi was surrounded by the storm. Rain hammered the deck like stones. Winds screamed through the rigging, producing a sound that was almost human, a deep rising wail that made even experienced sailors uneasy. The ship began to list, leaning slightly to one side. At first, only a few degrees. Barely noticeable to anyone not trained to feel it, but sailors feel everything. And soon, whispers spread through the ship. She's tilting, the coal's moving, water's coming in. Something's wrong. The pumps were activated immediately. Men worked feverishly to keep the flooding under control, but the more they pumped, the faster the ocean seemed to fight back. Inside the engine room, the heat was suffocating. Sweat dripped onto the metal floor, mixing with coal dust to form black streaks across the workers' uniforms. Steam hissed, valves strained. The engine hammered at full force, pushing the ship through the towering waves. Everything on board felt tense, alive with fear. Above deck, the storm was relentless. Sheets of rain blurred the horizon. Thunder cracked like cannon fire. Lightning illuminated the raging sea in violent flashes, each one revealing a world of chaos. Yet still, the Cotopaxi moved forward. Still, the crew worked. Still, the ship fought. But nature had already made its decision. By December 1st, the Cotopaxi had drifted into the heart of the storm. The wind reached dangerous speeds. Waves rose taller than two-story buildings, smashing into the bow and sweeping across the deck with destructive force. The ship leaned farther to port. Crew members struggled to maintain balance as they moved. Every step felt like walking on shifting ground. At some point, we will never know exactly when the hatch coverings finally gave out. Not completely, but enough. A sudden rush of seawater surged into the coal hold, transforming the cargo into a deadly avalanche of wet mass. The ship lurched sideways, lights flickered, lanterns swung violently. Crates toppled. Voices shouted in the dark. Men scrambled into action, but the ship had already crossed the threshold where human effort makes little difference. From that moment on, the Cotopaxi was a vessel fighting not just the storm but itself. At approximately 12:30 p.m. on December 1st, 1925, the radio operator managed to send the ship's final transmission, listing: taking on water, 2 short pieces of information, 2 fragments of truth, 2 signs of impending doom. There was no time for a detailed report, no time for coordinates. No time for a plea. This was not a message sent from a stable ship. It was a message sent from a vessel on the edge of collapse. After that, silence. The kind of silence only the sea understands. When the Cotopaxi failed to arrive in Havana on schedule, concerns began to grow. At first, quietly, then loudly. Families demanded answers. Shipping officials tried to remain calm. Weather reports painted a grim picture, but as days passed, as the storm faded, as the ocean settled again, nothing was found. No debris, no bodies, no lifeboats, no floating wreckage. Just waves. Endless waves. The sea had swallowed everything. A routine voyage had become a tragedy, and, in the years that followed, something even more powerful, a mystery, one that people would twist, reshape, sensationalize, misunderstand, and romanticize for nearly a century. But the truth, the real truth, was still hiding in the deep, waiting, silent, untouched since the moment the Cotopaxi vanished beneath the waves. And the search for that truth, for the wreck, for the explanation, for the story that mattered, would take the world decades to uncover. 4 days after the Cotopaxi failed to arrive in Havana, silence was the only answer anyone received. The ocean, which had raged with unforgiving fury when the ship fought its final battle, now stretched calm and indifferent beneath the winter sky, offering no clues, no signs, no hints of what it had taken. Shipping officials attempted to remain optimistic at first. Storms of that magnitude often forced vessels to divert course, slow down, or seek temporary shelter. It was still possible, they told themselves, that the Cotopaxi was delayed, repairing damage somewhere offshore. But deep down, every sailor knew the truth. This kind of silence, this total absence of communication, rarely meant safety. Families gathered at ports waiting for news that never came. Mothers stood near radios, praying for one final transmission. Wives stared at the sea, searching for a silhouette on the horizon. Children tugged at their fathers' old hats, asking when the ship would return, but the horizon remained empty. The ocean had made its decision. As days turned into weeks, the Cotopaxi's disappearance evolved from concern, into fear, into inevitability. Search efforts were launched along its expected route. Ships scanned the waters. Lookouts strained their eyes against the glare of the winter sun. Aircraft passed overhead, flying low, sweeping the region for any trace, a lifeboat, a piece of hull, drifting cargo, anything. Nothing appeared. The storm that had battered the southeastern coast had been powerful enough to scatter debris for miles, yet the sea offered nothing. No floating wreckage, no oil slicks, no wooden planks. It was as if the Cotopaxi had slipped beneath the waves and been erased from existence. In reality, of course, the ocean rarely gives up its dead easily. Strong currents, shifting sands, and the immense weight of the coal cargo would have dragged the ship downward with extraordinary force. But in 1925, without modern sonar or deep-sea equipment, the searchers were effectively blind. Eventually, the official inquiry came to a quiet, resigned conclusion. The SS Cotopaxi was lost with all hands. No further explanation could be offered. No precise location could be identified. The sea kept its secret. And that silence, that vast void of information, would become the seed of something much larger. A myth was about to be born. In the years that immediately followed the disappearance, the Cotopaxi faded from public attention. There were no major headlines after the initial reports, no widespread panic, no dramatic theories. The ship was mourned, then quietly archived as another maritime tragedy, one among many. The 1920s and 1930s were full of such stories. The sea was a dangerous place, and countless vessels met similar fates. But somewhere in the background, the Cotopaxi lingered, a case without closure, a question without an answer, a tragedy without remains. And though the world moved forward, the story never truly died. All it needed was time. By the 1950s and 1960s, the world had changed. Mass media was evolving. Television, radio, and paperback books created a perfect storm for sensational tales of the unknown. People were fascinated by the supernatural, by disappearances, by enigmas that defied explanation. And somewhere within this cultural shift, a new idea emerged, a triangular region of ocean where ships and planes supposedly vanished without reason. The Bermuda Triangle. Suddenly, old tragedies resurfaced with new meaning. Writers searching for stories to fill magazines and mystery anthologies dug through archives looking for disappearances that could be labeled unexplained. When they stumbled upon the Cotopaxi, the fit seemed perfect. A ship that vanished, a crew never found a route vaguely near the region, and no wreckage ever recovered. It didn't matter that the Cotopaxi didn't actually disappear inside the Bermuda Triangle. It didn't matter that the real cause was a storm and structural failure. It didn't matter that the final distress signal described an entirely natural emergency. Two writers hungry for mystery, the details were optional. Thus, a new identity began to form. Not the Cotopaxi that once sailed the seas, but the Cotopaxi that existed in rumor, in fiction, in the imagination, a ghost ship, a symbol of the unknown, a vessel swallowed not by nature but by legend. And as the decades rolled on, those legends only grew. Books claimed the ship vanished without a trace. Articles insisted the crew disappeared, under mysterious circumstances. Some writers went further, inventing strange radio messages, phantom sightings, and supernatural explanations. None of it was true, but truth rarely stands a chance against a great story. The Cotopaxi, once a simple steam-powered cargo ship, was now being described in the same breath as unsolved phenomena and paranormal events. And the most astonishing transformation came in 1977, when Steven Spielberg featured the Cotopaxi in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. In the film, the ship appears intact in the Sahara Desert, a surreal, iconic image that burned itself into the minds of millions. Cinema had sealed its fate. From then on, the Cotopaxi wasn't just a lost vessel. It was a myth, a mystery, a ghost story whispered across generations. But the truth still slept beneath the waves untouched, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for the day when the real story, not the legend, would finally surface. As the myth of the Bermuda Triangle grew stronger through the mid-20th century, the Cotopaxi's real story drifted further and further away from public memory. The ship had been reborn, not in steel, not in the logs of maritime historians, but in the imagination of a world hungry for mysteries. But myths have one weakness: they cannot withstand the weight of evidence forever. And long before the world knew it, the Cotopaxi's truth was already waiting beneath the surface, silent, buried, unmoving, but intact enough to speak once someone finally knew how to listen. By the late 20th century, technology was advancing fast. Sonar systems had improved, diving equipment was safer. Underwater exploration, once nearly impossible at great depth, was becoming more accessible. In the 1980s, recreational and technical divers began exploring shipwrecks along the coast of Florida. The region was full of them. Storms, currents, and centuries of maritime traffic had littered the seabed with the remains of vessels from different eras. Among the many wrecks found, one in particular stood out. A large, twisted structure of corroded steel lay about 35 miles off the coast of St. Augustine. It didn't match the common wooden wrecks of the 19th century. It didn't match known ship losses from World War II. It was something else. Divers gave it a simple nickname: the Bear Wreck. At the time, no one knew what it was. No plates survived. No readable markings remained. Just a mangled hull, 2 large boilers, steel ribs fractured like broken bone, and silence. Divers visited it now and then. Photographs were taken. Fragments were catalogued. But nobody not yet connected this wreck to the Cotopaxi. The myth was too strong, and the ocean too large. Few believed the legendary ship could be hiding in such an ordinary place. In the early 2000s, a different kind of explorer entered the picture. Not a treasure hunter, not a thrill seeker. A scientist, Michael Barnett, a marine biologist and accomplished technical diver, became fascinated with the Bear Wreck. Unlike many before him, he suspected that this wreck had a story to tell, a story older and more significant than anyone realized. Barnett spent years piecing together clues. He compared measurements. He studied engine layouts. He examined hatch designs, boiler configurations, and the curvature of steel beams. Every detail mattered. He also dug through forgotten archives, old construction records, shipping logs, and blueprints from the Great Lakes Engineering Works, the shipyard that built the Cotopaxi. Bit by bit, a picture began to form. The dimensions matched. The structural layout matched. The machinery matched. Even the boiler design aligned perfectly with those used on the Cotopaxi. But in science, suspicion is never enough. Barnett needed more, and then he found it. A small, corroded valve, buried in decades of sediment, carrying a faint but unmistakable stamp, a manufacturer S-mark linked directly to the Cotopaxi's original construction. It was the missing piece. Almost 100 years after the ship vanished, the truth was finally rising from the depths. Once Barnett's discovery gained academic attention, a formal investigation began. Teams of experts in maritime archaeology, industrial engineering, oceanography, shipbuilding, history, corrosion analysis, and sonar mapping all joined forces. They examined every joint, every plate, every torn section of steel from the wreck. They compared it with historical data. The conclusion became unavoidable. The Bear Wreck wasn't just a ship, it was the ship, the SS Cotopaxi. After nearly a century, the ghost had been found, not in the Bermuda Triangle, not drifting near Cuba as fake articles once claimed, not intact in a desert as movies imagined, but quietly resting in the same waters where it had fought its final, hopeless battle. The sea had never hidden it maliciously. It had only held it, as it holds all lost things. In January 2020, the team made the revelation official. News outlets around the world carried a headline that many believed they would never see: SS Cotopaxi shipwreck identified after 95 years. For a moment, the legend paused. The world looked back, not at the myth, but at the men who died, the storm they faced, and the truth that had finally come home. People who grew up hearing wild stories about the Cotopaxi learned, perhaps for the first time, the real tragedy behind the name. Historians updated records. Scientists celebrated a victory. Descendants of the crew finally learned where their relatives lay. For the first time, the Cotopaxi was not a ghost, not a rumor, not a cinematic fantasy. It was a ship again. A real ship with a real story, and a real place in history. The identification didn't erase the myth immediately. Legends rarely die in a single day. But it weakened it, cracked it, exposed the truth beneath the layers of invented drama. People discovered the Cotopaxi did not vanish inside the triangle. It sent a distress call describing a normal flooding emergency. It sailed into a tropical storm known to history. It sank in a location fully consistent with the weather records. Its wreckage showed no mystery, only damage caused by nature. The truth was simple and powerful and human. For nearly 100 years, the world had been chasing ghosts. In the end, all that remained was a ship, a hard-working, flawed, vulnerable ship, and a crew that fought against a storm they could not overcome. But the most important part of the story was still ahead. How exactly the Cotopaxi sank, what the wreck revealed, and what the last moments were really like. That revelation, the final reconstruction of the tragedy, the confirmation of the Cotopaxi's wreck, did more than solve a mystery. It opened a doorway into the ship's final moments. With the wreck identified, scientists and maritime historians could finally reconstruct, step by step, what happened after that last desperate radio message was sent, listing taking on water, two simple phrases. But beneath them lay an entire chain of events, complex, mechanical, and terrifying, that led to the ship's destruction. By analyzing the wreck's condition, hull deformation, structural failures, and internal damage, experts discovered that the Cotopaxi's death was not a sudden, supernatural event. It was a slow, violent breakdown born of weather, instability, and the unforgiving physics of the sea. The storm that the Cotopaxi encountered was far more intense than early reports suggested. Weather archives from late November 1925 reveal a system with high-velocity winds, steep waves, and rapidly shifting barometric pressure, a perfect scenario for disaster. Out at sea, the Cotopaxi was caught directly in its path. Waves towered above the bow, slamming onto the deck with the force of collapsing buildings. The ship's metal skeleton vibrated under each impact. Water cascaded over the hatches, dripping through seams that had long been weakened by rust and years of hard freight work. Inside the cargo hold, the coal began to absorb water. At first, this added weight gradually, almost harmlessly. But moisture changes the behavior of coal. It transforms from a solid mass into something frighteningly unstable. Soon the hold was no longer carrying a static load. It was carrying a shifting, liquefying weight. With each roll of the ship, the coal sloshed like a heavy tide, pulling the vessel sideways. The list increased. A few degrees at first, then more. Gravity, water, and cargo were beginning to work against the Cotopaxi in perfect deadly synchrony.
Down in the lower compartments, crew members fought desperately to keep the flooding under control. The pumps roared as they expelled water back into the sea, steam blasting through the engine room in white clouds. But no matter how hard the men worked, the pumps could not keep up. Water was entering faster than they could remove it. Every gallon that poured into the hold added weight, and every pound of weight pulled the bow lower into the storm. The ship's center of gravity began to shift. As the hold flooded, the coal mass slumped violently to the port side, tilting the ship even further. Pipes groaned, deck hinges strained. The entire vessel leaned against the pressure like a wounded creature. Above deck, officers struggled to maintain order. Men clung to rails, slick with rain, salt water, and coal dust. Lanterns swayed wildly as lightning carved white-hot lines across the sky. Some sailors prayed, others shouted orders lost to the wind. All of them fought against the inevitable truth building beneath their feet.
The most critical detail came from examining the wreck itself. Damage patterns showed where the sea had forced its way through weakened hatch, covers metal plates that had been flagged for repair months earlier. Storm waves don't knock gently. They slam, they crush, and with enough force they shatter. Once the hatch covers weakened, water poured freely into the hold. The influx destabilized the ship beyond recovery. The Cotopaxi was no longer fighting a storm, it was fighting physics. When a cargo ship loses stability, the process accelerates rapidly. More water enters, cargo shifts, list increases, pumps fail, crew loses access to key areas. The ship becomes uncontrollable. Every step pushes the vessel closer to the point of no return, and the Cotopaxi had crossed it. Inside the engine room, men were confronted with the most dangerous scenario a steamship can face. Flooding near the boilers. Salt water hitting superheated metal creates explosive steam bursts, visions blur, temperatures spike, sound becomes disorienting, a mixture of mechanical screams and the roar of water forcing its way in. As the flooding intensified, the boilers began to fail. Pressure dropped, the engine choked, propellers slowed. The Cotopaxi was no longer moving under its own power. It was now a helpless metal shell being tossed through the storm. With propulsion gone, the bow took the wave's broadside, the worst possible orientation. Each wave slammed into the hull with direct, unwavering force. The list deepened, the water rose, and the crew understood what was coming next. Evidence from the wreck suggests that the Cotopaxi did not sink bow first like many vessels. Instead, it rolled. A sudden, violent roll to port, the result of water, shifting coal, and external wave pressure acting simultaneously. When a ship reaches a certain angle, recovery becomes impossible. Gravity takes over. Momentum seals its fate. The Cotopaxi crossed that threshold. The deck tilted sharply. Men lost their footing. Equipment slid. Crates tumbled. The world turned sideways. Then, in one catastrophic motion, the ship rolled and began its descent. Air rushed from compartments as water rushed in. The hull groaned and twisted under the pressure. Lights flickered out. Darkness swallowed the interior. And then silence. The Cotopaxi plunged toward the seafloor, dragged down by its cargo, its structure, and the immense force of the storm. It hit the seabed with a force strong enough to deform steel and scatter debris across the sand. And there it remained, undisturbed, untouched, unseen, for nearly a century. What the world would later mythologize as mysterious was, in truth, simple. The wreck lay in a region of strong currents, shifting sands, and deep, dark water. A place where technology of the 1920s could never hope to reach. The sea did not hide the Cotopaxi out of malice. It hid the ship because that's what the sea does. It buries, it erases, it transforms steel into relics and storms into silence. And while myths rose above the surface, while the Bermuda Triangle story grew into legend, the real Cotopaxi sat quietly in the cold depths, waiting for the world to look in the right place, with the right tools, and the right knowledge. The truth had always been there. It simply needed someone willing to dive deep enough to find it. For nearly a century, the Cotopaxi lay in darkness, a twisted monument to a storm long forgotten, a frozen snapshot of the moment nature claimed victory over steel. Above the surface, its fate was distorted by rumor, fiction, and sensationalism. Below the surface, its remains told a very different story. Only one thing was missing: someone willing to unravel the truth. The answer finally came when modern researchers, armed with new technology and renewed determination, began analyzing the wreck with fresh eyes. The discovery of the Cotopaxi was not just the end of a search, it was the beginning of understanding. With the wreck identified, scientists now had access to something far more valuable than speculation: evidence. Steel bent in a specific direction, hatch frames torn in ways consistent with water pressure, boilers displaced from their foundations, hull plates warped inward, not outward, proving damage from the sea, not explosions. Sections of the vessel buried beneath sand, exactly where a heavy coal-laden ship would hit the seafloor. Every detail of the wreck, every twist of metal, every corroded joint revealed another piece of the puzzle. And as the data accumulated, the picture of those final moments sharpened with astonishing clarity. When divers examined the wreck for the first time with full awareness of what they were looking at, one fact became immediately apparent: the ship had gone down fighting. The bow was deeply embedded in the seabed, angled downward as if the Cotopaxi had attempted one last push against the storm before succumbing. The stern lay twisted slightly to the left, a silent confirmation of the fatal portside roll that scientists had suspected. Collapsed beams, torn bulkheads, and the position of the boilers all aligned with a vessel that had been overwhelmed by water at extraordinary speed. Inside the wreck, sediment filled almost every compartment, but beneath that sediment, researchers could still recognize the skeleton of the ship: ladder frames, engine components, rotary mechanisms, piping systems, fragments of railings and deck supports. Part of the superstructure collapsed inward. The Cotopaxi had not exploded, broken apart mid-sea, or vanished mysteriously. It had died exactly as physics predicted: pulled down by sheer weight, crushed by water pressure, and buried by time. The ocean had preserved the truth better than the world above ever had. As experts explored the wreck, the scientific details were crucial, but the emotional dimension was impossible to ignore. Every twisted beam, every collapsed corridor, every fragment of the vessel represented the final environment experienced by the 32 men aboard. Their last steps, their final efforts, their desperate struggle to save the ship. There were no skeletal remains. The ocean does not preserve bodies at these depths over such long spans of time, but the human presence lingered in the arrangement of the wreckage itself. Tools lay scattered in places consistent with emergency repair attempts. Metal bars used to reinforce hatches were found where crew members would have tried to brace them. Heavy equipment had shifted violently in the final roll, pinning what once had been passageways. The Cotopaxi wasn't just a piece of steel. It was a tomb, one shaped not by myth, but by effort, courage, and the last acts of men fighting for survival. As research continued, the findings left no room for the supernatural interpretations that had once surrounded the Cotopaxi. The wreck showed no signs of sudden disappearance, violent anomalies, unexplained damage, unusual environmental phenomena, anything inconsistent with a storm-driven sinking. The truth was straightforward and far more tragic than the myths. The Cotopaxi did not flee into another dimension. It did not enter a cursed zone. It did not simply vanish. It sank in the most human way possible through a combination of structural vulnerability, severe weather, and the limitations of early 20th century maritime technology. The Bermuda Triangle had never been involved. The mystery had never been supernatural. What people had interpreted as unexplained was, in fact, simply unknown until modern science shed light on it. When the identification was made public, the world experienced a strange moment of collective realization. The Cotopaxi, a ship long believed to be lost in the realm of the impossible, was finally grounded in reality. News outlets reported the discovery with a mix of fascination and relief. For many, it felt surreal to see a legend reduced to truth. For others, it was a reminder that mysteries endure only as long as evidence remains undiscovered. But for the descendants of the crew, it meant everything. For nearly 100 years, families had carried a wound made of questions. Where did my relative die? What really happened? Was he afraid? Was he alone? Did the ship sink slowly? Did he ever have a chance? The discovery did not offer comfort, not in the traditional sense, but it offered closure. The men aboard the Cotopaxi didn't vanish without a trace. They weren't part of a supernatural event. They fought a storm, they fought physics, they fought until the end. And now, at last, the world could honor their struggle with accuracy, dignity, and truth. Beyond settling a century-old mystery, the Cotopaxi's rediscovery became a case study for maritime experts around the world. Through its remains, researchers examined the dangers of transporting unstable cargo, the structural vulnerabilities of World War I-era steamships, the consequences of insufficient hatch maintenance, the evolution of storm forecasting practices, the need for modern ship safety standards. The Cotopaxi transformed from a ghost story into a classroom, a monument to lessons learned not only about history, but about engineering, weather, responsibility, and the risks faced by maritime workers. Its tragedy helped modern ships become safer. Its story helped reshape our understanding of maritime disasters. Its rediscovery corrected decades of misinformation. And its final resting place, quiet, somber, peaceful beneath the waves, became the ultimate witness to the truth. Nothing supernatural, nothing inexplicable, just the ocean, time, and a ship that fought bravely against forces too powerful to overcome. The identification of the Cotopaxi's wreck did not end the investigation, it ignited it. With the ship's resting place finally known, researchers began a meticulous reconstruction of its final hours, not through speculation, or legend, or imagination, but through the silent testimony of steel, pressure, and physics. The wreck had become a time capsule, and every twisted beam, every fractured frame, every section of hull preserved in the sand held a memory of the storm that claimed the ship. The Cotopaxi could finally speak, and what it revealed was not a mystery, but a tragedy written with absolute clarity. Modern analysis confirmed what experienced sailors in 1925 already suspected. The Cotopaxi was in critical condition even before the storm. The storm did not create the disaster, it exposed it. The hatch covers, old, weakened, and poorly maintained, were the ship's Achilles heel. When the storm intensified, the immense weight of water slamming onto the deck forced its way into the cargo hold. The moment seawater reached the coal, the fate of the ship was sealed. Wet coal behaves like liquid cement. It shifts unpredictably. It redistributes weight unevenly. It destabilizes a vessel almost instantly. As the coal sloshed inside the hold, the Cotopaxi began its fatal list to port. The list caused more water to enter. The water caused more coal movement. The movement caused the list to worsen. A chain reaction, irreversible, merciless, unstoppable. Experts now agree that from the moment the hatch covers failed, the Cotopaxi likely had less than an hour to live. No skill, no heroism, no mechanical effort could have saved her. The storm had merely been the trigger. The ship's vulnerabilities had done the rest. The structural damage found at the wreck site provided astonishing detail about those final minutes. Engineers discovered buckled hull plates where the ship hit the seafloor, bow-first fractures along the lower port side, consistent with a violent roll, collapsed bulkheads, crushed by sudden water pressure boilers torn from their mounts, thrown forward by the ship's rapid descent, twisted deck supports, bent by internal collapse rather than external impact. These details aligned perfectly with the scenario of catastrophic flooding, imbalance, and structural failure. Every mark on the wreck echoed a moment of that final struggle. The Cotopaxi had not simply sunk, it had been overwhelmed, suffocated, and crushed. It still remembered everything.
Although no human remains survived, the wreck revealed the last actions of the men on board. Tools were found in positions indicating attempts to tighten hatch clamps. Metal bars had been set into place seafoots to reinforce failing structures. The arrangement of scattered equipment suggested a desperate attempt to reach the pumps and engine controls after the flooding began. These were not the actions of a crew caught by surprise. They were the actions of men fighting until the very last second. The Cotopaxi did not die in silence or confusion. It died in combat, a struggle between human determination and the unstoppable physics of the sea. And in the end, the storm won.
Based on hull analysis and sediment displacement, scientists determined that the ship likely sank in a single uninterrupted motion. There was no breakage on the surface, no explosion, no fragmentation before impact. The Cotopaxi rolled, took on water rapidly, and dropped like a stone. The descent would have been swift, a matter of minutes. Inside the ship, darkness consumed everything. Air pockets collapsed, water pressure surged, metal screamed as the hull buckled. Then, in a final moment of violent silence, the ship struck the bottom of the ocean. The impact buried the bow deep into the sand. The stern twisted and fell to one side. Sediment cascaded over the remains, beginning the long process of preservation above. The sea returned to normal. Waves smoothed out, clouds drifted, wind calmed. The world never saw the Cotopaxi again. For 95 years, the ocean carried on as if nothing had happened. Storm after storm passed overhead. Fish moved through the ruins. Coral and sponges grew over rusted beams, turning the site into an artificial reef, while myths swirled above the surface, while stories about the Bermuda Triangle flourished, while fiction reshaped the narrative. The real Cotopaxi remained motionless, untouched by human eyes. A ship of steel consumed by time, a grave for 32 men. A reminder of the unforgiving nature of the sea. All the while, the world argued about supernatural forces, mysterious vanishings, and impossible explanations. But the truth had always been there, quietly waiting. When the wreck was finally identified, the transformation was instantaneous. The Cotopaxi stopped being a ghost story. It became a documented shipwreck, a scientific case study, a memorial, a chapter of maritime history restored. Facts replaced fiction. Evidence replaced speculation. Reality replaced legend. The ship that had once been used as fuel for mystery books and sensational headlines was finally understood through the lens of truth. It had not been a supernatural disappearance. It had been a human tragedy, and one that mirrored many others in the early 20th century. The Cotopaxi's story, real, raw, and devastating, was far more powerful than the myth that had overshadowed it for decades. The rediscovery of the Cotopaxi didn't just correct the record. It gave the ship and its crew something they had been missing for nearly a century: a place. A real, physical, identifiable place in the world, a final resting point, coordinates on a map, a location where memory, respect, and truth could finally converge. The mystery was gone, but the meaning remained. And as the world came to understand the scientific reality behind the tragedy, something even deeper emerged. A recognition that truth is not only more accurate than myth, it is more human. The Cotopaxi was no longer a symbol of the unknown. It was a story of courage, effort, and the fragile boundary between man and nature. A story recovered from the deep. A story that could finally be told as it truly happened. With the Cotopaxi's final resting place confirmed and the truth behind its sinking fully understood, researchers and historians found themselves facing an unexpected challenge: not the mystery of what happened, but the question of how the world had gotten the story so wrong for so long. For nearly a century, the Cotopaxi's disappearance had been twisted, romanticized, and pulled into the gravitational field of myths like the Bermuda Triangle. The ship had never been mysterious, but the legend had a life of its own. To understand why the truth took so long to emerge, one must look at the strange intersection of culture, fiction, and human nature that transformed a tragic accident into a global myth. When the Cotopaxi sank in 1925, the world's attention was elsewhere. Technological progress, political changes, and cultural shifts overshadowed the tragedy. Maritime accidents were tragically common, and the world simply accepted the loss. But decades later, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the world had changed. A new kind of curiosity was spreading. Television, mystery magazines, paperback thrillers, documentaries that blurred the line between fact and fiction. People wanted stories that challenged logic, stories that hinted at forces beyond understanding, stories that gave everyday life a touch of the extraordinary. And so, writers began searching through old maritime records for disappearances that could be framed as unsolved. The Cotopaxi was perfect. A ship lost at sea, a final distress message. No debris found, all hands perished, a vague route near the infamous triangle-shaped region. It didn't matter that the details were imprecise. It didn't matter that storms were documented. It didn't matter that the crew's final message clearly indicated flooding. In the landscape of mass media, accuracy was optional. Emotion was not. And so, the Cotopaxi was reborn, not as a ship, but as a mystery. Magazines published dramatic retellings, complete with fabricated dialogue and embellished reports. Sensational headlines proclaimed the ship's disappearance as unexplainable, despite the perfectly explainable truth. The legend expanded further when authors began linking the Cotopaxi to the rising mythos of the Bermuda Triangle, a region that was, itself, largely a media creation. And then came Hollywood. In 1977, Steven Spielberg immortalized the Cotopaxi in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The iconic scene, a massive steamship resting inexplicably in the Sahara Desert, etched itself into the collective imagination. Millions of people saw that image. Millions of people believed the Cotopaxi was a supernatural case. Millions of people forgot the real story. The ship that had been built by human hands, sailed by human hearts, and lost to a very human storm had been rewritten into something completely unreal. By the turn of the 21st century, Truth and fiction were so tangled that most people had no idea the Cotopaxi was even a real ship. It had become pure legend. As the internet emerged, the legend only grew stronger. Fake articles went viral. Edited photographs were shared as evidence. One infamous hoax in 2015 even claimed the Cotopaxi had been found drifting intact near Cuba, a story entirely fabricated, but captivating enough to be shared across the globe. It didn't matter that the story was false. It felt exciting, and that was enough for many. That Cotopaxi had become a victim of the digital age, a symbol twisted by clickbait, conspiracy theories, and the global appetite for unexplained phenomena. All the while, the real Cotopaxi remained quietly where it had always been, resting in darkness, waiting for someone patient enough to cut through nearly a century of noise.
The truth is finally out. In 2020, scientists officially identified a shipwreck off the coast of St. Augustine, and the world had to face a hard fact. The mystery of the SS Cotopaxi was never really a mystery at all. It was simply forgotten. For decades, people chose to believe the myth, the spooky story of a ghost ship lost in the Bermuda Triangle. But the truth was always there, recorded in historical documents. Now, for the first time, we can tell the real story. We know about the violent storm, the flooding cargo holds, the failing structure, and that desperate final radio call for help before it sank. The Cotopaxi wasn't a ghost ship. It was a real tragedy, a powerful reminder of the unforgiving nature of the sea, and a perfect example of how easily truth can be twisted when the evidence is lost beneath the waves.
The discovery of the wreck did not simply correct the record, it forced the world to reconsider how history is written. The Cotopaxi is now a case study in how misinformation spreads, how myths overshadow facts, how cultural narratives reshape memory, how real tragedies can be distorted into entertainment, how important it is to preserve historical accuracy. It taught the world that mysteries are often born not from the unknown, but from the forgotten. And when the truth finally emerges, it doesn't erase the tragedy, it honors it. The Cotopaxi's rediscovery brought the story back to its core, not the myth, not the legend, not the fantasy, but the people. 32 men who boarded a ship in Charleston, simply trying to do their jobs, never imagining that history would twist their fate into something unrecognizable. Their story was not supernatural, it was human. The storm they faced was real. Their struggle was real. Their loss was real. And now, after nearly a century, their truth is real again. Not hidden, not distorted, not overshadowed by fiction. The Cotopaxi has been returned to history, to the world, to the families, to the sea. The story of the Cotopaxi, once shrouded in myth and distorted by decades of speculation, now feels entirely different in the light of truth. No longer a ghost ship wandering through the fog of legend, it stands revealed as something far more profound, a testament to reality, to human effort, and to the unforgiving power of the sea. When the wreck's identity was confirmed, the world finally gained something it had never had before. Not a mystery solved, but a tragedy understood. Understanding changes everything. It transforms the Cotopaxi from a supernatural curiosity into a vessel of human memory. It turns a rumor into a lesson. It turns the unknown into a story that honors the 32 men who lived, worked, and ultimately perished aboard that ship. This final chapter is not about the sea taking the Cotopaxi, it is about what the Cotopaxi gives back to us now. For nearly 100 years, the Cotopaxi existed in two parallel worlds. One world was built on myth, filled with mysteries, triangles, ghostly vanishings, and impossible explanations. The other world was the truth, a real ship battered by real storms, fighting for survival with real men aboard. Only one of those worlds deserves to endure. The rediscovery of the wreck finally returned the Cotopaxi to the realm of fact. The ship is no longer a canvas for wild theories. It is now what it always was, a hard-working steam freighter built in the final months of World War I, maintained by sailors who depended on it for their livelihood, and lost to a storm it simply could not withstand. Its legend may have captured imaginations, but its reality commands respect. Every shipwreck is a tomb, and the Cotopaxi is no exception. But its rediscovery allowed the world to recognize what had been lost in the noise of fantastical stories. There were men aboard that ship, men who shoveled coal into roaring furnaces, men who tightened bolts in the rain, men who stood on deck watching the storm build over the horizon, men who held their posts until the ship tilted too far to walk, men who fought until the final second. Their courage, their effort, their final struggle, they were real. And for the first time in nearly a century, the world can finally honor them without the distortion of myth. The Cotopaxi's wreck is not simply a relic. It is a memorial written in steel and sand. a reminder of every sacrifice made in the long, dangerous history of maritime labor. The Cotopaxi story teaches us that truth may be slow, truth may be buried, truth may be overshadowed by legends, but truth never disappears. It waits sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, sometimes, like in this case, for almost a century. The ocean kept the Cotopaxi hidden, but it did not erase it. It preserved the evidence that would one day restore history, and when the truth surfaced, it changed the narrative forever. It reminded the world that science, patience, investigation, and respect can overcome generations of misinformation. It reminded us that the real world, with all its storms, dangers, and tragedies, is more powerful than any myth ever written. Today, the Cotopaxi rests peacefully on the seafloor off the coast of St. Augustine. Its steel is softened by rust. Its engines are frozen in silence. Marine life moves gently through the remains, turning the wreck into a sanctuary of quiet beauty. There is no fear there, no mystery, no legend, only memory. The twisted beams, the collapsed hull, the buried bow. They all tell the story of a ship that fought a storm and lost, but whose truth endured long after the world invented a fiction around it. The silence of the wreck is not haunting. It is dignified, a silent tribute to the men who never returned. As the story of the Cotopaxi closes, it leaves behind lessons that reach far beyond its steel frame. That real stories matter more than myths, that the sea demands respect, not superstition. That human courage is often overshadowed by sensationalism but deserves to be brought back to light. That every shipwreck has a voice, if we're willing to listen. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all, the truth, once discovered, becomes a beacon guiding us through the fog of misinformation into the clarity of understanding. For the families of the crew, for the historians who searched for answers, for the divers who risked descending into the dark, for the scientists who pieced together the evidence, the Cotopaxi is no longer a ghost. It is a story completed, a truth reclaimed, a memory restored. And as long as that truth is told, the Cotopaxi will never again be lost.